Today's propers are absolutely overflowing with truths like God's mercy and pity and grace that we heard in the collect. But also there are two diametrically opposed things that are at work. What are those two things? Pride, the father of all sins, and humility. And so we are going to think about these things, and we will look at three men in the epistle and the gospel. The Pharisee and the publican of the parable, two parabolic people, and St. Paul, who was a real-life champion of the faith, to be sure. Now, when we examine them, what do we see? What do we learn? Well, it depends not only about what the preacher or the homilist says, but what are you going to do about that when you hear and think and study and pray about the Pharisee, publican, and St. Paul? The first thing we can say, I think with blessed assurance most assuredly, is that comparisons are oftentimes unhealthy and can reflect sin rather than sanctity. The example that we're thinking about is the Pharisee. Walked proudly into the temple, and he looked sideways, kind of a evil glance, looked sideways to the publican and probably thought in his mind's eye, "Oh, I'm so much better off than that fellow." And actually then articulated that braggadocio thing when he bragged to God about it in his supposed prayer. Better off than that fellow? So what? What does that mean? One's wholeness and holiness has nothing to do with another's supposed or real emptinesses. Admittedly, the publican was a sinner, and yet at the end of the parable he went away justified. The Pharisee, not so much. There was no prayer. That wasn't a prayer that he did. It was more of a campaign speech, just vacuous and nothing there oftentimes, and most assuredly it happened for the Pharisees and all of us too, I guess. You see, comparisons simply do not count unless you compare yourself to Christ. Then you can. And you will most assuredly, if you're doing it with heart, mind, and soul, you'll grow in God's grace and meet him in the end, most assuredly also. So that's comparisons. They don't count unless you do compare yourself to Jesus. Number two, humility leads to what? Forgiveness. Our example is the publican. He who smote his chest and said, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." The Bible identifies humility in both the Old and the New Testament, time and again, as an attribute of the godly. When man humbles himself, he is spared and blessed and lifted up by the hand of God. In point of fact, the parable, the psalmist tells us, he will not forget the cry of the humble. God will not forget the cry of the humble. And the parable declares that very powerfully when we hear it being taught and we respond appropriately. But how can a person have the audacity to be in the presence of God and pridefully puff himself up like the Pharisee did? I'll tell you why. It's part of the teaching of the parable. The Pharisee was godless. He knew not God. If he had, he would often have turned and become humble also. But he was godless, and he didn't know who God was. I'll tell you what it was. The Pharisee's God was a concept. Oh, we have that played out in many of our areas in the United States too, within the context of churches. Concepts, no, not concepts. God is God. And you know the first two commandments, it's called the summary of the law. Love God with your heart, mind, and soul. and love your neighbor as yourself. The reason there's two of them like that, first of all, if you want to love your neighbor, you got to love God first. You have to see how much God loves you in spite of who you are. And when you understand that, then you can love your neighbor. Oh, which I thought he was bad, but maybe we're supposed to love our neighbors also. So there we see where we are lacking in the relationship and can attempt to overcome those inadequacies when we finally fall in love with God, so as to love more fully. No mirror. We don't get up in the morning and go into the bathroom and look at ourselves in the mirror and then start singing that song, "How Great Thou Art." Don't do that. That's a farce. It's a fallacy. Quit pridefully thinking about ourselves all the time, because that's one of the sins that we have. We just look at ourselves and think nothing of other people. Number 3, humility is not a euphemism for weakness. Those who are truly humble are seldom what the world would call winners. In point of fact, the world calls many humble people losers. And that's the world's lie, however. That's what people sometimes think, but it's not true. Humility is not at all a negative. It is a precursor, a harbinger to God's forgiveness. You can see that played out in the parable this day. Now, also, Paul is our example of that, of humility. Great testimony and proclamation. Paul, some people just think he was, filled of himself. Not so. Here's what he said in the epistle this day: "I am the least of the apostles, that am not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." So he knew who he was. And then he goes on and says, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am. His grace which was bestowed upon me was not in vain. I labored more abundantly, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me." You see, that's a humble proclamation by a strong man for sure. There will come a day when we will all be opened up and the truth of who we are will be evident. And the glory of it is that God knows today what is in our heart and mind and soul. So what do we do? Well, let him know. You know he knows. He loves us. We just have to respond appropriately to his love and presence in our life. What to do? Make the publican's prayer our prayer. God, be merciful unto me, a sinner. Then go into the world and live life not like the Pharisee, but the publican and St. Paul. They were transformed, and we can be too if we allow ourselves to be so. And then finally, let's become this man of today's gospel narrative. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalts himself shall be abased, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. That's the truth of the gospel.